Yoga and brainwaves. So this video is about how our brainwaves are related to the expansion of our consciousness. And we'll also talk about states versus stages in regards to that expansion as well. So let's start out by understanding what are brainwaves. First of all, the brain emits electrical pulses, which are measured per second. And these pulses are measured by an EEG, an electroencephalogram. And as these cycles per second, or CPS, speed up or slow down, the rate of our thoughts speed up or slow down, along with variations in our mood. So how were these brain waves discovered? Well, they were discovered in 1908 by an Austrian research psychiatrist who used an EEG to discover alpha waves first. In fact, they were called alpha because alpha means first in Greek. But since their discovery, other brainwave types have been found, and extensive research on the 5 main brainwave types have been going on for some time now, and we'll get a brief introduction to them in this video with additional videos to follow on each brainwave if you care to do research more in depth and understand more what the different brainwaves are and how they're related to yoga and the expansion of consciousness. So let's look now at the 5 types of brainwaves, and we're doing a brief introduction of these. There's a video on each one of these if you want to know more. Starting with the one that we are typically most involved in, and that's beta brainwaves. And beta is 13 to 30 cycles per second. And here we are busily engaged in activities and conversation. Our minds in general are pretty active, either in thought or in speaking out loud. Then there is alpha, which is 8 to 12 cycles per second. And this is when we're a more relaxed, dreamy, childlike state. In fact, children have a lot more alpha, theta, and delta brainwaves than adults. As adults, we tend to become more beta. Alpha is relaxed, dreamy, and this is more involved in mindfulness meditation, where we are aware of our thoughts and simply observing them. It's also involved in imagining and visualization exercises. And then there is theta, which is 4 to 7 cycles per second. Now, compare that to beta, and you can see that we're 3 to 4 times or more involved in thoughts than we are in theta. Theta is that drowsy drifting into sleep space where we're barely aware of our thoughts, and we can know a little bit that we're awake but not yet asleep, and yet mostly asleep. And at the same time, theta is involved in things like lucid dreaming, as is gamma, which we'll talk about in a moment, and also deeper meditation states where thoughts are slowing down. And then there is delta, 3 to 5 cycles per second, and here we're either deeply asleep, we're not dreaming, or we're in a deep meditation samadhi type state. Then there is gamma, which has been discovered most recently, and that is 31 to 120 cycles per second. And you may be fascinated to see that I put a picture of a meditator there. Actually, this person is not necessarily in deep meditation. They're using the namaste gesture, which indicates a certain level of spirituality that uses creativity to be selfless. In fact, those that have a high degree of compassion and empathy tend to have more gamma brainwaves. Gamma originates in the thalamus and spreads out through the entire brain. So gamma brainwaves are more akin to whole brain learning or whole brain integration. There's a certain synthesis. And this kind of hyper learning or super creativity is done in such a way that one feels as if they're in the zone. They're just flowing. So it's a unique kind of thought that doesn't seem like that really active monkey mind jumping around thought that you experience in beta, or you may be learning to observe in a mindfulness meditation in alpha. Rather, it is a very rapid synthesis of ideas and thought that just moves into a flow that paradoxically may seem as if you're not in any thought at all. So one of the things that we are learning through spiritual practice, the peaceful self process, or yoga, is how to keep our brains in balance and our brainwave states in a healthy mode. When they are imbalanced, problems ensue, and when our brainwaves are not functioning well, a variety of difficulties can emerge, and the list that follows shows how we can cause difficulties in our brainwave activity that can be hard to shift, though it's not impossible. So 6 reasons for brainwave imbalance include injury to our brains. This injuries can happen through, there's a lot of controversy with football and head injuries, or it can be in accidents or something like that, or we can injure our brain over time through bad habits. But as consciousness identified as the peaceful self, we can still learn to access the information or draw the people to us who can help us to change our brains, change our life, to use the title from the book by Dr. Amen. So there is still hope, even in the worst trauma, brain injury, that can upset our brainwave function. Drugs is another reason for brainwave imbalance, prescribed or otherwise. So we have to learn to be very careful with the kinds of drugs that we are using. Now, some people in spiritual practices use particular drugs to try and achieve certain brainwave states. Again, we want to do that consciously and not deal with drugs as a means to get us there. And we'll talk about states versus stages in a little bit. We want to be able to keep our brain waves in a certain stage and not just every now and then have a certain state of being in a altered state through brain waves. We want to learn how to do that consciously and directed. So we need to be careful with the use of drugs. Another way that we can cause brainwave imbalance is through fatigue. So learning how to really practice over the long run is a lot better than doing something really as a crash course. You're a lot better off meditating or taking up spiritual disciplines over years, every day doing a little bit, than you are going through some sort of intensified practice, because you can cause fatigue and imbalances, and these imbalances in your brain waves can also cause imbalances in perception and processing of what's going on, especially regarding spiritual experiences. Another thing we want to be careful about is emotional distress. In fact, in a lot of spiritual practices, the major focus is to first learn how to become more sattvic, or in that peaceful, more balanced, poised place with your emotions. That doesn't mean that you do a spiritual bypass and you don't work with emotions and learn how to work with them effectively by suppressing them. We don't want to do that. But we also want to understand that when we're in emotional distress, we need to take care of that to get our brain waves back into balance. Pain is another thing that can cause difficulty with brain waves. And finally, stress. So we want to be careful to moderate these things and work with these things as soon as they appear. If we're fatigued, we want rest. If we're stressed, we want to maybe try and go from a beta brainwave state to an alpha or theta brainwave state, or even delta, get some good sleep so that we can heal. Emotional distress, sometimes we can approach that with some good theta type work. Or we may also do that through trying to get into gamma more, because these things help create more happiness. So we can learn about the different brain waves and learn how to train our brain consciously and in a directed way. So there is a growing amount of research being done regarding brain waves in connection with yoga and meditation. And if you want to know the specifics about this kind of research, I invite you to look that up on the internet. But in general, this research is showing that brainwaves are activated by a variety of spiritual practices, the main one being meditation, but also, especially at the gamma levels I've mentioned a few times now, the more we become selfless, the more we cultivate empathy and loving kindness, the more we have healthier brainwaves and higher brainwave states. Various brainwave states are also active as you learn to consciously direct your thoughts. We can start out in alpha, learning to be mindful. We can get into theta, learning to lucid dream. We can get into gamma to consciously cultivate empathy and loving kindness. Various brainwaves help us to cultivate happiness, develop psychic abilities, learn to lucid dream. So learning how to understand when we're in a certain brainwave state helps us to understand, are we in the right zone, so to speak, to cultivate the particular skill that we want. And from a yoga perspective, you can learn to consciously move from rajas, a more active state. You can be in beta, to tamas, a more passive state, to sattva, a balanced state, to create more peace and serenity in your life. For example, you may realize that you're too tamasic. Maybe you're in an environment where you're too much into an alpha state. You're just kind of drifting and dreaming, or you're learning a lot about spiritual practice through meditation, but you're not being active in engaging the world and applying what you know. So you may need to switch to beta. You may be too tamasic, and you need to be more rajistic. So again, these are ways that we can become more aware. And there's even equipment you can buy, such as a wonderful headband that I myself enjoy, where you can measure what brainwave state you're in to see how you're actually doing in terms of staying in a more sattvic balanced state. Now, I mentioned already states versus stages, and this concept was originated by Ken Wilber, but it's very important to understand because brain waves are basically like going through a tunnel, let's just say as a metaphor. So as we slow down our brain wave states, our cycle per second, we move more into an altered state of consciousness. But that doesn't mean necessarily that we're staying in a higher state of consciousness. Everybody goes into deep sleep. They go from beta, alpha, theta into delta. Not as many people go into gamma, but everybody goes from beta, alpha, theta to delta. It's like we go through this particular process, I'm calling it a tunnel, as we go to sleep, and then as we wake up again, we go delta, theta, alpha, back into beta. Actually, there's a sleep cycle where we may go delta and then theta and then alpha. We may actually wake up and go back into beta, etc. So it isn't just that we go beta, alpha, theta, delta, stay there and then come back out. There's an actual sleep cycle that I'm not talking about here at the moment. But what I want you to understand is you may meditate or do a spiritual practice and pop into a higher brain wave state. But that doesn't mean that you are at a spiritual stage. For example, it doesn't mean that you've learned mastery over your physical body and environment, that you really, for the most part, have learned how to work with your various emotional states effectively, that you have mastered your mind and your thoughts, that you're primarily in that Buddhic plane of intelligent wisdom and a compassionate heart, or in the Atmic plane, which we're not commenting on much here, where you have the use of spiritual will to help better not only yourself but the world around you. So it's really important to understand this difference. Why? So it's really important to understand the difference between these states and stages because, as I said, we all go to sleep and go through the different brain states and wake up. And we can all have certain meditative or mystical experiences or become involved with drugs or be involved in some sort of athletic activity that gives us a certain dopamine high. We can all do that. But when it comes to the stage of our development, have we mastered our emotions? Or are we still pretty much disrupted by them? Are other people still pretty much able to take us off track? We only get through the stage of emotional mastery when we're, let's say, at least 70, 75%, 2/3 to 3/4 of the time in our lives throughout our day, able to handle our emotions effectively and other people's emotions effectively. And when we achieve real mastery, that goes up even higher, 90, 95%. I doubt anybody's at 100%, but it goes pretty high. That's when we've mastered the stage. We can also begin to have control over our thoughts, and we may lucid dream and learn how to create our own reality and imagine what it is that we want, but it's primarily egotistic or selfish. It's not really something that serves others. So we may master our minds and be able to suppress our emotions and still be at the egotistic or selfish stage. It takes a lot more to be able to really anchor ourselves within the peaceful self, within the Buddhic plane, where we're not popping in and out of now I'm spiritual, now I'm not. Or I'm doing a spiritual bypass and I think I'm spiritual until I have to face life and deal with money and deal with sex and deal with other people's issues and be tempted and not be in my nice little private world where everything just goes my way. I have to be out in the world, and suddenly I'm learning I'm not really that kind or compassionate when I'm faced with real problems, real issues, other people's needs and demands. That's why relationships are one of the best forms of spiritual practice, actually, because it really shows us where we're really at. So only when we master the stages where we become not intermittently selfless and selfish, kind of mingled up together, and that's okay if we're there, just acknowledge that's where we're at and keep striving to move to the next step until eventually you master the next stage. Now, you may have a peak experience where you are in a state where you feel like you love everybody and everything in the universe. And then you come out of it, and a few days later, you're busy yelling at your partner or your parents or your kid or your friends. And that lets you know, have you really mastered the stage, even though you've experienced the state? And it's really important to understand this difference when we're looking at brain states. So that concludes this particular intro video. You want to learn more about my work or who I am? Please read the slide that follows, both this slide and the next one.